Greetings and welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. Very glad to be here with you. A few days ago, the AARO office, that's the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, issued a report. Let's call it a historical overview of UAPs, once upon a time known as UFOs. I'm going to be discussing that, but I want to start off with a question that I want you to ponder as we go through this report. The question is, has our ruling establishment ever been at a more delusional point in its history than it is currently? Just a question for you to think about as we go through the material here today. In the first place, I'll just say we have never had honesty from this establishment regarding UFOs or UAP, not since we've collectively started becoming aware of the phenomenon itself. That's a history of more than 80 years. This establishment, let's call it the national security state, has not been honest about very much over the years. We can now see with a lot of historical perspective that although prior generations might have held a little bit more faith and trust in the truth value of what that institution kept telling it, through Vietnam, for instance, or about the Kennedy assassination even, or about more recent debacles like the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, or the destruction of the nation of Libya about a decade ago, or the ongoing attempts to take down Syria, which continue to this day, or the clearly incompetent assessments of relative strength among combatants in Eastern Europe, specifically Russia. What we see is a national security apparatus that A, lies seemingly all the time, and more recently, B, can't get its act together. The U.S.-led entire Western establishment certainly has never looked so out of touch, so incompetent, so reckless, so dangerous as it currently does. And that's not even getting to UFOs. But the UFO or the UAP problem has always been a tough one for them. Honesty has never been an option for them, at least in their opinion. Never been an option, never possible. That's also worth pondering. The whole concept of UFO or UAP disclosure has been on my mind for a long time, many years now. A long time ago, I speculated that we, the people, are in a kind of foot race with the establishment on this whole matter of disclosure. In other words, whoever gets to the finish line first wins. As I put it many years ago, if we get there first, that means that we achieve a real breakthrough in obtaining valuable, actionable information on this subject before the global clampdown of information is complete. That's the race. While there's still time, if we can do that. Because as was quite evident even 15 to 20 years ago, there has always been this concerted effort by that very same global establishment to lock down the flow of information to their liking. Now, that whole thing is a long conversation. I've discussed this many times on my website, richarddolanmembers.com. Go check that out. Or also on this channel, talked about this race that we're in with the establishment. In short, we are in the midst of a global revolution that demands, in my view, demands a reorganization of the entire human species in order to meet the needs of a 24/7 digital panopticon, spying network, surveillance network, in which centralized control is deemed as necessary for its very functioning, and which can really no longer allow wiggle room for such archaic notions as human freedom. Sorry to bring this news to you, but that is the inexorable direction we are being led to, at least in my view. How to stop and reverse that direction will be the work of many, many people dedicated and who dedicate their lives to finding another way. But the point is that if the ruling elites obtain full control over all digital information flows, and if they do that before we get the breakthrough that we want in terms of disclosure, well, then they will continue to dominate the narrative of UAP disclosure. And this is an issue that just cannot be avoided. The whole idea of disclosure is not something that can just be kept off into some vague, indefinite future any longer. This isn't 1950 anymore, after all. The world has moved far beyond what our grandparents understood regarding this subject. This is an era of far greater sharing of information than ever before, and it's therefore inevitable that something is going to, some things are going to come out, as they have been coming out, and will be acknowledged. So the question is how much, how far, and what basic truths will be acknowledged or admitted by them, by the people who really are still attempting to control the flow of information in our world. If they lock the world down before we get what we need, we can be pretty sure that very little or probably no incriminating information will ever come out. The truth, if we can call it that, will be spoon-fed to us just as they prepare it for us. That's their vision. So before I describe some of the many untruths in the recent AARO report, I want to emphasize that a lying and delusional ruling establishment is what we are looking at here. Not only when we look at its reckless, dangerous, and fantastical visions of the rest of the world, but we see this delusion in its relationship to the UFO UAP subject. This delusionality, this deception, it's really very seamless. The very same establishment that lies to us about every single war that it gets us involved in is the same establishment that lies to us about UFOs, UAP, as every new generation enters the world. Now, for the last 6+ years, if you've been looking carefully, what you've been seeing relating to UFOs is a battle, a war going on within this national security state with its own factions. Now, in the beginning of all of this, from 2017 onward, and still to some extent today, you still hear there are people out there saying that the entire disclosure effort was or is a false flag, an effort to scare you into running to the military for protection. This gave me a lot of eye rolls in the early years. It still does to this extent whenever I hear it. This is clearly not true. It's been more than half of a decade. Where are the DoD people even admitting that there are aliens here, much less dangerous ones? They're not stating this, not even a little bit. In fact, what they're doing is exactly the opposite. But what we have seen is a well-positioned faction of people, most with some level of security clearances. That is, people who are in the game, right, to a greater or lesser extent. Some of them have made the statement that UFOs are real, or now UAPs are real, and are a potential threat. And moreover, they've been arguing that the public needs more openness on this matter than what we've had in the past. I'm not convinced that all of these people believe in full disclosure on the subject, but I think all of them do seem to believe in at least some disclosure. Some of them maybe more than others. In other words, what we are seeing is a factional battle within this establishment. And frankly, this is the norm in all ruling establishments throughout all of history. There have always been factions. There's always been differing opinions on how things should be. This subject of UFOs is no different. You got the pro-UFO faction. They have their allies and their opponents. And we have been seeing this play out right before our eyes for the past 6+ years. The latest iteration of this battle is the recent AARO report, apparently authored by Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick. I say apparently because I think there can be no doubt that there was a lot of staff support in putting this together. The document certainly reads like it came out of the Pentagon's bureaucracy. I've got some slides here I'm going to show you in a moment, but right now I'll just give you my own sense of the kind of a bullet point version of what this report says. So one, this report reviews, as it says, the United States government's record on UAP since 1945, since the end of World War II, states that it has found no evidence that any U.S. government investigation or any academic sponsored research or any official review panel has confirmed that any sighting of a UAP represents extraterrestrial technologies. In other words, no evidence of ET tech in any of the long history of UFO UAP sightings. That's one conclusion. Another conclusion is that most sightings have been concluded to be ordinary objects or ordinary phenomena as the result of misidentification. The report also debunked, or tried to debunk, I'll say, claims that the U.S. government and private companies have been reverse engineering ET tech. It says absolutely not. We looked, there's no evidence for that. The report also addressed the notion that the U.S. government has recovered several off-world vehicles or spacecraft, and that there are ET, extraterrestrial biological remains. It says there's none of that. There's no evidence for any of that. The report stated that the incidence of UAP sightings that have been reported to U.S. government, the claims that some of these are ET craft, the claims that the U.S. has secured and is experimenting on alien tech are most likely the result of different factors, cultural, political, technological, and so on. And there's a few other things in there. I'll have a link below so you can download the report. I would encourage you to do so. And what I want to do is go into some of, I want to go into first, I want to remind you, let me just say, of some of the genuine UFO, UAP history, particularly of the early years. This is something that I've studied in great detail over many years, and I'm reminding you, and maybe if Sean Kirkpatrick is watching, reminding him of some of the key statements that we know took place during the early years of UFOs, flying saucers, and so forth. Famous FBI memo from 1949 to the director of the FBI, this J. Edgar Hoover, featured there. It's a multiple page long document. It's very interesting. I'll just pull two paragraphs here where it states, this is an FBI to Hoover, this matter of flying saucers is considered top secret by intelligence officers of the Army and the Air Forces. Again, the plural of Air Forces back then was related to World War II and before, when it was always in the plural. And it goes on, just says, during the past 2 months, various sightings of unexplained phenomena have been reported in the vicinity of the Atomic Energy Commission installation at Los Alamos. Goes on, there's a lot more very fascinating information in that particular memo. And I'm just pointing this out to you here to ask yourself, for you to ask, why would UFOs be considered top secret in 1949, in early 1949? Why would they be top secret if there's really nothing to them, if it's all conventional and you know, case of mistaken identity? It would certainly be reasonable, you would think, for the U.S. government to tell the public, look, you're making a big mistake here. There's nothing to these flying saucers. But why would they therefore need to classify that as top secret if there is actually nothing to it? Obviously, the AARO report does not even address that question whatsoever. What we see in this one little statement by the FBI, and there are many, many others like this, is that this subject was being taken very seriously at extremely high levels of the United States government, intelligence community, military establishment during the 1940s and all through the 1950s as well. So a fascinating document from summer of 1950. It was a confidential memorandum issued in August of that year that talked about a series of fascinating and, I would say, disturbing violations of the sensitive airspace over the Hanford nuclear plant in the state of Washington. They built plutonium. They were creating plutonium there at that time. This is a very, very important place. You can see by the picture, there's a lot of technology going on at Hanford in 1950. This memo states that since July 30th, 1950, objects round in form have been sighted over the Hanford Atomic Energy Commission plant. Round in form. What are these objects? It goes on, it says Air Force jets attempted interception with negative results. Well, that's interesting. It goes on and saying all units, including the anti-aircraft battalion, radar units, interesting, Air Force fighter squadrons, and the FBI have been alerted for further observation. Oh, that's quite interesting indeed, I would say. The Atomic Energy Commission states that the investigation is continuing. That's also interesting. All of that's fascinating. You have an area of very prime national security importance in 1950, that nuclear plant for sure. You've got objects round in form being seen over it. Very interesting. What are these objects round in form? Are they Russian? Well, there's never been any evidence that that's the case. And by the way, the fact that this investigation was said to be continuing, well, that's interesting too. But the fact is that no FOIA request ever found the follow-up results to that supposedly continuing investigation. I'm sure it was continuing. And just as certainly, we don't have any information on how that was concluded. Very interesting. But imagine what the U.S. public, or the world public, for that matter, would have thought if that particular memo, just that one, would have been released to the public in 1950. I think people would have been quite interested in wanting some follow-up on that matter, indeed. But of course, the whole point of the UFO cover-up is that the public was not given this type of information, and that the very important concerning data was always kept away from the public. We learned about this, these types of sightings through the, you could say, accident of FOIA, the accident of freedom of information. And I'm going to call it a historical accident. How is it that the Freedom of Information Act became as powerful as it is starting in the 1970s? And the answer is because there was a political scandal involving the president, Richard Nixon, at the time. There was a very concerted mood in Congress and among the public about demanding a little bit more transparency from the government, and the result was a strengthening of FOIA in 1974 that directly resulted in the unexpected release of quite a few very interesting UFO documents at that time and through prior decades. That's the only reason we know about these. And even those documents, what we received, were generally speaking not of the top secret level. They were of lower levels of classification. And even so, they're still very interesting, as that one is that I showed you. There are so many more like that, but I'm not going to, the point is not to go over all of the classified documentation, but I just want to point out this last classified statement from this man here. I consider this a very key statement in the early UFO cover-up. And this is by a man named H. Marshall Chadwell. Chadwell, in 1952, was the director of scientific intelligence for the CIA. So he was a very important individual at that time. And in December of 1952, he wrote a secret memo to his boss, the director of the CIA. That was Walter Biddle Smith, a very, very famous person himself. And Chadwell says in this letter, this classified memo, at this time, the reports of incidents convince us that there is something going on which must have immediate attention. Sightings of unexplained objects at great altitudes and traveling at high speeds in the vicinity of major U.S. defense installations are of such nature that they are not attributable to natural phenomena or known types of aerial vehicles. Yeah, that's H. Marshall Chadwell. It's a statement that I have long considered this a very key declassified statement that we the public have and must always hold on to, because it's important. It's a bureaucratic memo. A guy like Chadwell is not just going to say, boss, I think we're being invaded. But when you read that statement very carefully, I'll show it to you again here, not attributable to natural phenomena or known types of aerial vehicles, you have to ask yourself, well, what does that leave you with? These are objects at high altitudes, high speeds, near sensitive installations. They're not natural, and they're not anything that we know. Are they Russian? Well, there was never any evidence that this was Russian. And by the way, Dr. Kirkpatrick in his study offers no evidence whatsoever in this 60-plus page document that the Russians or Chinese or any other nation had anything to do with these UFO sightings. It's not in there because it's not available. There is no genuine evidence to point to that. And Chadwell knew this as well. So it's, excuse me, a very important statement indeed. I have one other individual I just want to bring to your attention. This is the first director of the CIA. This is Navy Vice Admiral Roscoe Hillenkotter. UFO students know this name very well. Hillenkotter directed the CIA for 3 years, from 1947 to 1950. and was a friend, a good friend actually, of Major Donald Keyhoe, who was one of the key early UFO investigators of the 50s and 60s. Keyhoe and Hillenkotter actually went to Annapolis together. They were classmates, so they knew each other going way, way back. Keyhoe made a good name for himself doing a lot of other things, even prior to the whole UFO subject. Keyhoe had actually flown with aviation legend Charles Lindbergh, so he'd made a name for himself. But he and Hillenkotter were friends, and Hillenkotter joined the board of the organization NICAP in the late 1950s. And by the way, I think it's a rather interesting historical fact that the very first director of the CIA was a member of NICAP. Where are the academic historians in the universities who are even interested in bringing this matter up and studying this? They're not around. They don't discuss this at all. But in any case, Hillenkotter made a number of very interesting statements relating to UFOs, and I just want to bring these to your attention. I've got several. These are two that he made with NICAP as a board member in the late 1950s. He said, "It is imperative that we learn where the UFOs come from and what their purpose is." Imperative. That does not sound like someone who believes that these objects are misidentifications of natural or conventional phenomena. That is for darn sure. And secondly, he says here, "I know that neither Russia nor this country, the US, had anything even approaching such high speeds and maneuvers." He's talking about Foo Fighters during World War II and immediately after the Second World War. Neither Russia nor the US have anything approaching what these things can do. And then, of course, there's a more famous statement Hillenkotter made in 1960. This has been quoted many times. I'm going to quote the full statement here. He says, "Behind the scenes, high-ranking Air Force officers are soberly concerned about the UFOs, but through official secrecy and ridicule, many citizens are led to believe that the unknown flying objects are nonsense. To hide the facts, the Air Force has silenced its personnel through issuance of a regulation. Veteran airline pilots and other technically trained observers have been discredited. Hundreds of authentic reports, many confirmed by radar or photographs, have been labeled delusions or explained away by answers contrary to fact." That's Hillenkotter in 1960. You have a situation where there's an overwhelming amount of historical documentation speaking to the reality of the UAP UFO phenomenon. And again, look, this is something I've discussed for over 20 years. Lots of my previous YouTube videos talk about the historical evidence of UFOs. I encourage you to go check those videos out. Do go to my website, richardolanmembers.com, see what we've got going on there. Check out some of the books I've written on the subject. It's all laid out there as clear as day. Lots of citations. I try to make this very clear for even the most rigorous of skeptics so that they know where the information that I put in there comes from. It's all out in the open. We have an overwhelming situation that proves, it doesn't hint, it doesn't suggest, but it proves that not that UFOs are necessarily alien, but there is absolute proof that the UFO UAP phenomenon has, let us say, caused great concern to leading members of the United States national security community for over 80 years. That is an undeniable, you can take that to the bank fact. And for some of the reasons that I just delineated here for you, you've got just unexplained sightings of these objects. That doesn't even get into the whole situation of crash retrievals, acquisition of ET tech. I'm going to discuss that in a moment. But just as a bit of a foundation, now as we dive into the AARO report, there's Sean Kirkpatrick. This is a screenshot of the cover page of the AARO report. Again, link below. You can download the PDF yourself and read it for yourself. I'm just going to go into some of the additional, like the specifics of the evidence that he puts out. I gave you a bit of an overview. So one of the things that he says is there has no evidence of crash retrieval. These are direct quotes out of the report. "No empirical evidence for claims that the U.S. government and private companies have been reverse engineering extraterrestrial technology. He says claims involving specific people, known locations, technological tests and documents allegedly involved in or related to the reverse engineering of extraterrestrial technology are inaccurate. He says AARO has no evidence for the U.S. government reverse engineering narrative provided by interviewees and has been able to disprove the majority of the interviewees' claims. Some claims are still under evaluation. So that's really very strong blanket statement, isn't it? Of course, what you find when you go through all of these claims is that there is no transparency as to where the information is coming from. It's like, when you were in math class back in junior high school, your teacher always said, show your work, show your work. Well, that's what never happens in this report. There's no evidence of showing any work whatsoever. Claims are made, and there's no evidence to support these claims whatsoever in any case. There are very strong statements, but there's actually there's nothing that you or I or anyone else can jump in there and say, oh, I see exactly what you mean. That does not exist with this report. It's lazy on that basis, and we really have to say it's deceptive. When you have any individual in a position of authority, especially someone who claims to be a scientist, as Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick does, in any instance in which you are using your profession for anything other than a dispassionate engagement of the truth needs to be considered a violation of the principles of your profession. It's a betrayal of intellectual honesty, and it's really using your position to engage in propaganda rather than research. And that, in fact, is, I think, what we can say is going on here. And look, I'm not trying to go after Sean Kirkpatrick personally. I have nothing against this man. Could be a very nice person for all I know. And if he is, I wish him the best. But as an employee of the Pentagon, it's very obvious that he has got a job here. And he is doing his job, and he and his staff and the people around him are working institutionally for the Pentagon, not really as private researchers with his own considered individual opinion. This is obviously an institutional effort that we're seeing here. Let me just talk about the metamaterial, since to my surprise, he refers to this, not by name as the metamaterial, but he absolutely does refer to this. I thought it was very interesting. So let me give you a little bit of background of this piece first. This is an image of it. This was an artifact that allegedly came from a UFO crash retrieval in the 1940s. And incidentally, the trail to the original source of that is, I will say, somewhat known to me. I know individuals who are on top of this. I'm not directly involved in this investigation, but that is ongoing. The point is that artifact was presented in the 1990s, this artifact here that you're seeing, to Art Bell, radio host back in those days. Art Bell didn't really know what to do with it, and eventually gave it to Linda Moulton Howe, the researcher, who he argued, and I think rightfully, would be in a better position to shop this piece out to scientists who could actually study it properly. And she did that. Two of the scientists that Linda Moulton Howe provided this to were Drs. Hal Puthoff and Dr. Eric Davis, very well known, of course, in the UFO UAP community. I have a little more to say about that, but this is what Dr. Kirkpatrick says about the metamaterial. I'm going to read this to you. He says, experimentation on alleged extraterrestrial spacecraft sample. AARO has concluded that a sample from an alleged crashed off-world spacecraft that AARO acquired from a private UAP investigating organization and the U.S. Army is a manufactured terrestrial alloy and does not represent off-world technology or possess any exceptional qualities. He goes on and says, the sample is primarily composed of magnesium, zinc, and bismuth with some other trace elements such as lead. This assessment was based on its materials characterization. Unfortunately, he has nothing else to say on the material except an utter dismissal of it as anything unusual or anything exceptional. No exceptional qualities. Well, I just want to read to you the statements of Dr. Hal Puthoff, who discussed this very same metamaterial that he studied along with Dr. Eric Davis for an extended period of time. I suspect much more involved than what the AARO office did. Dr. Puthoff discussed this in 2018 at a gathering of the Society of Scientific SSE, Scientific Exploration, Society of Scientific Exploration, excuse me. And he spoke there in June of 2018. The video's out there on Vimeo. It's very interesting talk. I learned he wasn't expecting that this would be recorded and put out to the web, but there you go. And there's very interesting statements. So these are a few of the statements that Dr. Puthoff said about this particular material. He said, it was a multi-layered bismuth and magnesium sample. Bismuth layers less than a human hair. Magnesium samples about 10 times the size of a human hair. It looks like it's been in a crash, he said. Goes on, some attempts were made to try to reproduce this material, but they couldn't get the bismuth and magnesium layers to bond. When we talked to people in the materials field who should know, they said, we don't know why anyone would want to make anything like this. It's not obvious that it has any function. Well, he goes, so it was a big mystery when they're first looking at this, right? He goes on, though. He says, well, you know, decades later, actually, finally, our own science moves along. In other words, now, in 2018, he's saying, we are in a better position to understand this material. Well, that's quite interesting, is it not? He says, it turns out exactly this combination of materials at exactly those dimensions turn out to be an excellent microscopic waveguide for very high frequency electromagnetic radiation, terahertz frequencies. He has a bit more to say regarding that. I have discussed this actually on my website. Again, you go check out his video. You can find it out there. I'll see if I can try to link to it below. The point is, some very interesting high-level scientific speculation has occurred relating to that metamaterial, including the fact that the properties could, in fact, potentially allow it to act as a kind of anti-gravitic, that's the waveguide function, essentially an anti-gravitic function. It's very interesting. It's definitely above my own pay grade in the world of science. But certainly what we can say is that what we have learned of this so far does not indicate in the least that this is conventional, not interesting, or anything like that. And so why Dr. Kirkpatrick would come out and make such a blanket statement about the metamaterial like that, I find very puzzling. I'm very curious about that. And if there is a detailed study laying this out, I think we would all like to see it, wouldn't we? It's not that we have to believe the metamaterial has to be extraterrestrial, but look, if you're going to come out and make such a blanket statement on such a fascinating artifact that everyone's been watching and studying for a long time, that we have known about, I guess I should say, then let's have a little bit of transparency here. This is an important matter, and to treat the public as if they're not entitled to you showing your work is an insult, frankly. He goes on. Let's leave the metamaterial behind. One part of his discussion is that a number of experimental platforms in the past have contributed to the public thinking that certain things are flying saucers and UFOs when they're not. So he talks about that. And so here's the statement. AARO assesses that some portion of sightings since the 1940s have represented misidentification of never before seen experimental and operational space, rocket, and air systems, including stealth technologies and the proliferation of drone platforms. You notice like this is very, scientific bureaucratic language that he uses. It's really good window dressing. It really works very well to hoodwink the public. People think, oh, well, that sounds very scientific. Must be true. But again, when you peel the layers back, you find there's nothing inside. So let's go through some of these statements. He actually refers to the Manhattan Project as early as 1942 as something that contributed to a spike in reported UAP Like, really? So we're going to read this paragraph that he uses here. The secrecy surrounding the Manhattan Project and the establishment of several other national laboratories, such as Los Alamos National Laboratories, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, Sandia National Laboratories, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and Oak Ridge National Laboratory to support this effort probably contributed to the spike in reported UAP. Now, that's very interesting because logically, you have to ask yourself, what exactly did they do to make the public think that there were these flying saucers? What actually, there's no logic there. There's certainly no evidence supported there to make that statement. And I found it very questionable. But what is absolutely true is that from the mid-1940s onward, we have report after, not just claim, we have actual U.S. military intelligence community reports specifically stating that there are these UFOs over these sensitive nuclear installations, over Oak Ridge, many of them, over, as I just mentioned earlier, the Hanford facility, over Los Alamos in the late 1940s, early 50s. Absolutely. Now, the question remains, why and what were those objects? There is every evidence to indicate that those objects were, in fact, quite extraordinary. They were considered extraordinary at the time by the witnesses, by the scientists who studied them, and by the military personnel who wrote reports about them. There was a frantic effort at times to find out, is this Russian? Particularly in Los Alamos and New Mexico during the late 1940s. There were a series of high-level discussions that took place regarding this. And needless to say, no, there was no evidence that this was the Russians. There was no evidence even that this was a secret, covert U.S. project. And you've got high-level people with significant security clearances discussing this, and we've not seen any evidence that these were U.S. or Soviet projects. So it's a big mystery. Objects hanging out, sometimes landing, sometimes going up straight, sometimes making a non-inertial turns, like, sharp angle turns and so forth. Yeah, all of that. So that's an interesting element that Dr. Kirkpatrick and the AARO report did not address, but simply implying, and I have to say, dishonestly, that the Manhattan Project somehow contributed to these UAP reports, in a way that was basically the public thought that something they were doing mistakenly had to do with UFOs. But this is a very, very deceptive statement he makes here. He brings up the famous flying pancake, or the flying flapjack, it was called, the V-133, a really interesting aircraft, without a doubt. U.S. Navy developed this, and you can see in that image there, it's got a really interesting design. It's like a little pancake, isn't it? It's very flat, very wide, quite unusual for its time. And certainly from the bottom, you could say, yeah, it's got a little bit of a resemblance to a kind of flying saucer type craft. No question about it. As the AARO report points out, the craft could sort of take off vertically. I don't know how well it could, but that was the claim. Had a circular wing about 23 feet in diameter, about the size of a lot of reported UFOs. It could almost hover, couldn't, but almost. And, all of this is like close but no cigar. None of these, because you have countless reports of these UFOs hovering, even in the 1940s. And then the real kicker is that the U.S. Navy canceled the project in 1948. What UFO report exactly could be attributed to one of these objects? The suggestion is put out there by Dr. Kirkpatrick that the flying flapjack could have contributed to the UAP reports. Well, which ones? Which ones? The answer is none of them. You go through the history of these reports and ask yourself, which one of these could have been a flying pancake of the mid-1940s? It's not an honest, again, portrayal of the historical evidence here. He actually brought up Project Mogul. I guess, why should I be surprised, really? This is really one of the most discredited explanations for UFOs that I think I've ever seen. This, of course, was used to explain Roswell. 30 years ago, in fact, this is the 30-year anniversary of the Project Mogul report, which came out in 1994. So let me just read to you what Dr. Kirkpatrick has to say about this. The aim of this program was to secure intelligence on Soviet nuclear weapons testing and to provide an early warning mechanism for Soviet ballistic missiles. Project Mogul scientists worked on developing high-altitude balloons that would carry sensors capable of detecting long-range sound waves from weapons tests or missiles traveling through the atmosphere. So basically, you have a very large balloon train going up that has equipment that can detect a Soviet detonation of an atomic weapon. Back at that time, the United States had a monopoly of atomic weapons. The Soviet Union, the Russians did not. They were working on it. Everyone knew. No one knew how close they were to detonating one. And so Mogul was a project that was designed to give the U.S. knowledge of when such a thing happened. And so then what Kirkpatrick does here is stating a crashed balloon associated with Project Mogul outside of Roswell, New Mexico, is assessed to be the source of early UFO claims. Is assessed. I love that use of the passive voice. Assessed by whom exactly? Well, it was assessed by a U.S. Air Force study back in the early 90s, which they released in an era. You think of the early 90s. The U.S. Air Force was always used to getting its way. This is before the internet really became what it is. The Roswell subject had been on the ascendant for some years. By this point, rumors of bodies, of acquired technology were growing all through the 1980s and early 90s. Roswell witnesses were being interviewed by this time. This was a problem that was becoming a big thing. And the Air Force decided to get ahead of this one. And they put together a study that I think is the biggest joke of a study that the Air Force ever put together on UFOs. And just said, case closed. This is the Roswell Mogul balloon report, where they said, yeah, this was a balloon test. Now, you take a look at the Mogul balloons. Just look at that. All right. That is what is said to have come down and to have confused U.S. Air Force intelligence, a U.S. Army intelligence officer, Jesse Marcel. Now, to be a flying saucer. Like, it's one thing to make this claim without showing an image of what a Mogul balloon train is. But when you really look at these things, you have to ask, seriously, in the early 90s, the Air Force could absolutely feel that it could get away with making such absurd claims. What ended up happening, of course, is that a number of UFO researchers looked into this and called BS on the claims. But the thing that the establishment has always had, the Air Force has always had, and the military has always had in its favor, is that it has very excellent relationships with the mainstream media establishment. So, for example, back in 1994, Air Force releases its report, and it gets very positive coverage in the mainstream media. New York Times dutifully, reports what the CIA wants it to say, and so forth. That's what they've always done, and they basically do that to this day. So let's move on. I guess I could say to my surprise, but again, I should not be surprised. The AARO report references the U-2 spy plane. Now, this was a real canard, if I can use that. In other words, a mendacious lie. He repeats a fallacious claim that was made over 25 years ago. He says more than half of the UFO reports investigated in the 1950s and 60s, more than half, were assessed to be U.S. reconnaissance flights. Really? According to a declassified CIA assessment on reconnaissance aircraft. As I say here, this is patently false. This was a document by the late CIA historian Gerald K. Haynes, something I reviewed in the very beginning of my UFO research career, in fact. Haynes, wrote this study in 1997. You can actually download this on Amazon if you want to, or you can find the PDF. It's out there, called The CIA's Role in the Study of UFOs, a die-hard issue, he calls it. This 1997 was the 50th anniversary of Roswell. For those of you who might remember this, and the CIA and the national security establishment came out in as much full force as they could to throw as much cold water over the UFO subject as they could. And this article, the declassified version of it, was released to the public and got a lot of press, including in the New York Times, including elsewhere, of course. And Haynes made this utterly fallacious claim, among many other things, that more than half of all UFO sightings investigated in the 50s and 60s were of, essentially, he brings up the U-2 aircraft and other reconnaissance platforms that were developed in secret. The argument being, you know, we're testing our secret aircraft and we didn't really want you to know what that was. And if the public's interpreting these as UFOs, so be it. Now, it's a patently nonsensical claim when you really stop and think about it. Where was the U-2 flying? It was mostly flying over the Soviet Union because it was engaged in espionage. That's why one got shot down over the Soviet Union in 1960. You know, flying out of Turkey and elsewhere over the Soviet Union, and the Russians eventually shot one down. The U-2 was not just flown willy-nilly all over the country and all over the world. That's ridiculous. And the U-2 flew at over 60,000 feet and above, straight as a string. It didn't descend. It didn't hover. It didn't look like a flying saucer with lights around the ends. Didn't do any of that. And the other question is, you know, when Haynes published that report in 1997, myself and a number of other researchers wanted to know which reports exactly were likely to be a U-2 aircraft. And you go through the old reports, and it's basically none of them. I don't, you know, if there are any, you're talking about the smallest handful of reports that could have theoretically been considered UFOs. How Haynes made such a statement and got away with it, and now it just gets repeated. This falsehood gets repeated as a truism and is now used in this most recent report by the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office as a way to explain all this. I mean, it's using a lie as established truth without, of course, any examination of the actual evidence whatsoever. And that is where we're at. I've got a little bit more here to show you. He brings up the famous AARO car of the 1950s, which later became Project Silverbug when it was taken over by the military. So this is an interesting device. And as you see in the picture, that looks like a flying saucer without a doubt, the AARO car. What he writes here is Canada initially led an effort to develop a supersonic vertical takeoff and landing fighter bomber in the early 50s. AVRO or AVRO aircraft led the design for the concept, and this effort yielded the AVRO car, an aircraft with a circular shape that gave a stereotypical flying saucer appearance. One interesting thing about the AVRO car is that it didn't lead to a functional flying vehicle, but it did lead to the hover car, particularly useful over water surfaces and over the ocean. And it was, I don't know how widespread these are here, but it did lead to that. And it was not a complete dead end. Let's just read the report going on here. Canada pulled its support when the project became too expensive. The U.S. Army and U.S. Air Force took over the project in 1958 when AVRO offered it, when it became known as Project Silverbug. AVRO built 2 test vehicles that were designated as the VZ-9AV AVRO car, but the project was canceled in December 1961 when the vehicle could not lift more than a few feet off the ground. That's right. So the AVRO vehicle, now there could very well be more advanced black budget craft that are being worked on. Of course, none of those are discussed in the AARO report, but the AVRO car, as he points out, was canceled in 1961. So again, what examples of the AVRO car were ever mistaken for actual UFOs back in those days from the 1950s to 1961? I'm going to guess the answer is 0. zero. Now, does that mean that there are no secret tech programs then or now that could have been mistaken for actual UFOs? I would never say no to that. Again, that's not something he discusses. But then we have to ask, on what basis are those potentially breakthrough craft operating? Does that have any relationship to the true UFO phenomenon, that is, UFOs that have nothing to do with our civilization? I think the answer to that is yes. I think you've got the true UFOs that are not from here, and you've got very advanced platforms, none of which are discussed in the AARO report, that may also be responsible for at least some of these UFO reports. Let me pull up one or two more of these. Oh, yes, this is important. So actually, the AARO report discusses many other platforms and technologies that arguably contributed to UFO reports. I'm going to leave that aside. You can go through it yourself. There are a number of previous government studies and government-sponsored studies that are referenced in this report that are said to support the idea that there's no evidence of extraterrestrial. And he brings up Project Saucer and Sign of the late 1940s, Project Grudge, Project Blue Book, the infamous Robertson Panel, the Condon Committee, and many others. I mean, quite a few others, actually, which he stated that all of these studies support the idea that there's no evidence of extraterrestrial technology to any of these UFOs. Now, with the Condon Committee report, I'll just mention that one here. That, of course, was something done in the late 1960s. It was sponsored by the Air Force. It was paid for by the U.S. Air Force. It was conducted by the University of Colorado. Edward U. Condon was the director of that project. Very well known. It's called the Condon Committee Report. And it is true that that big fat book, which you're looking at right there, did conclude that there is no probative value, as it was said, to further study of these UFOs. In other words, nothing was going to come to science as a result of studying these. It was a waste of time. There's nothing going on here. And that the Air Force should just drop Project Blue Book and no longer study this. That was the conclusion. The thing is, when you actually look into the history of the Condon Committee, you find very different story. You find that roughly a third of the cases that they studied were actually very difficult to explain, and several came within a hair's breadth of an open admission that these were genuine UFOs. You have to read the data within it. Edward Condon, who wrote the conclusion, I think really many people believe didn't even read the actual report. I think the whole subject either bored him or he just had no interest in it. And all people really read were the conclusions. But within the data, it's actually quite fascinating. What we also know about the Condon Committee, just as a little historical footnote, is that there was a massive mutiny midway through the program when many of the scientists who were quite intrigued and becoming persuaded by the reality of UFOs realized that Condon and his number two, a guy named Robert Lowe, were dead set against any pro-UFO conclusion. And it really caused a mutiny midway through, and they were all fired. So that's actually what happened with the Condon Committee. But yet this is cited, among other studies, by the AARO report as supporting the fact that there's nothing extraterrestrial, nothing anomalous about this. And by the way, the same thing can be said with the entirety of Project Blue Book through the 1950s and 60s, the infamous Robertson Panel, the CIA-sponsored panel of January 1953, in which we now understand, this has been done by very good historical research, that the conclusions of that panel were in place before the panel even met. The idea being that UFOs needed to be debunked in the media, that this was a problem that the military really could not afford to just have out there. And so on and on and on. So none of these studies that were cited in the AARO report were actually scientific. All were politically motivated and all were deceptive. the information was deceptive, and yet, again, it's just put out there very, very almost blandly, I would say, but as padding, as filler, as a way to support the conclusion that there's nothing extraterrestrial going on here. Very interesting little side note I'll just mention here. There's a reference to the so-called estimate of the situation. Let me talk a little bit about this. In 1948, this is in the early days of the UFO subject, there was an extraordinary sighting by two commercial airline pilots in one aircraft. They both see this object zoom across their field of vision. They're down flying near Mobile, Alabama. This object goes past them. It's cigar-shaped or rocket-shaped as it goes across from them. It's got what looked like windows. They each drew it. Very, very similar. It's called the Child's Witted sighting, if you're interested in that. And it actually got a lot of attention within the Air Force study that was going on. It was Project Sign. They learned about this, and this developed into this was really just the latest of a many series of very dramatic UFO sightings. And it became a report by the Sign staff that was known as the estimate of the situation. This was written about in a book by Captain Edward Ruppelt, formerly of Project Blue Book, who said, I saw it. It was an estimate that said UFOs are real and they are probably interplanetary. That was the conclusion. The estimate of the situation landed on the desk of U.S. Air Force Chief of Staff, that's General Hoyt Vandenberg, pictured here, who said, don't like that conclusion, destroy this, give me a new conclusion. The Project Sign team was broken up after that, and better conclusions were offered to Vandenberg. So this is what the AARO report has to say here. Although the historical account is unsubstantiated and derived from only one source, Project Sign staff in late July 1948 allegedly drafted, signed, and sent a report, estimate of the situation, up the military chain for approval. This report allegedly concluded that UFOs were interplanetary in origin, but was rejected as lacking proof. Well, I'm just going to have a little bit of a quibble here. It is true that the estimate of the situation has never been definitively proven to exist. That is absolutely true, must be acknowledged. But it's not true that there's only one source for it. There's at least two. Edward Ruppelt, yes, on the left, who wrote about it, and who, by the way, talked about this privately extensively with retired Marine Corps Major Donald Kehoe. But that man to the right of Ruppelt, as you see there, is U.S. Air Force Major Dewey Fernay, who in 1958 made his own definitive statement supporting the authenticity of the estimate of the situation, stating that he had seen it as well. So Ruppelt and Fernay both saw it. You got two, not one, two U.S. Air Force officers. That's just a bit of a correction that I think ought to be made here. There's another statement in this report about something known as Project Blue Book Special Report number 14. I just want to make a statement here because I think that this is severely misrepresented in the AARO report also. What the report has to say here is that it was completed in late 1954, titled Special Report number 14. That is true. And then the report, AARO report writes, it concluded that all cases that had enough data were resolved and readily explainable. The report assessed that if more data were available on cases marked unknown, most of these cases could be explained as well. Excuse me. It also concluded that it was highly improbable that any of these cases represented technology beyond their, quote, present day scientific knowledge. Yes and no. So what we know is that, yes, the Battelle Memorial Institute created this report. They studied over 3,000 UFO cases over a period of 2 years, 1952 to 1954. Of these cases, this is not mentioned in the AARO report. Special report number 14 had a unidentified rate of 22%. And 69% were deemed as identified IFOs. So 22% were true UFOs. And by the way, it's worth mentioning that within that report, it was noted that the better quality witness, that is someone with good scientific training, someone deemed as an exceptional witness, made it that much more likely that the report was going to be a genuine UFO, something unidentified. In other words, the better the witness, the better the report, the more tough the report was, the more likely it was to be a UFO. What we have to keep in mind with all of these official reports is that there was always unbelievable pressure on these agencies to officially conclude, yes, that this is all conventional. The last thing that they were ever going to do is to get the public worked up and say, oh my God, it's real. The problem with that is once you acknowledge that something is real, and if you are the government, that means you're going to have to do something about it. And if you are unable to do anything about it, you're kind of stuck. And so the game plan has always been to deny that there is anything going on here. So what is this report really all about? This is a report that pretends to be scientific. It pretends to have institutional support. But when you peel off the layers, you find there's nothing inside, or very little inside. There's no substantiation for any of the debunking claims it actually makes, not in my view. There's a gross misrepresentation of the actual historical studies that it claims that support its position, that UFOs are not anomalous. There is a suspicious characterization of some very intriguing developments, such as the metamaterial artifact that I mentioned earlier. And one thing I didn't mention is the testimony of the apparently 40 plus insiders who have something to say about these crash retrievals or these acquisitions of UFO tech, UAP tech. The AARO report says we looked into these claims. It is said, a blanket statement, just don't add up. They're inaccurate. Well, how are they inaccurate? What actually are the claims and why are they inaccurate? We have no information whatsoever. I have been speaking to, I've not spoken to the witnesses, so I just want to be clear about that, at least none that I know that I've spoken to. But I do know individuals who have, and the impression that I have gotten from every source is that this is 100% legit. These witnesses are good. They are strong. I'm very interested in hearing just how they've been debunked before we even hear them. Very likely we're going to be seeing, I think there's at least a good chance of congressional hearings again on this matter. So I would like to know which ones have been debunked by the AARO report. Well, we don't get anything like that. We just get this blanket statement. There is no transparency in this report. There's no show me your work in this report. In fact, this reads very much like the debunking efforts of the past that it in fact mirrors. That is, strong debunking statements with mostly filler inside. That's really what you're looking at. It's filler pretending to be actual substance. There is no substance. There's really no science indicated here. In fact, I think that was a statement by Dr. Gary Nolan in regarding to this. And he's certainly in a position to say something like this, knowing a great deal about a lot of these things being discussed, including that metamaterial, and knowing how science actually operates. He made a statement to the effect that, yeah, where is your science here? Scientific group. There's no science that's being indicated here. Meanwhile, if you just read the report, the genuine problem of UFOs, the truly difficult nature of the phenomenon continues to be ignored. Well, I mean, really, what else could you expect? It's a sad but entirely predictable outcome. I mean, how could anyone really actually expect this institution to come clean on UFOs? They never have. And you really have to wonder what would it take for them to be able and willing to come clean on this. The U.S. military establishment is definitely not in a good way these days. Everything is going wrong for them. Yes, it's always been deceptive regarding UFOs and many other things. Yes, it lies to the public, pretty much always has. But this habit of deception is now being married, I would say, to a greater and greater detachment from reality, both regarding the rest of the world and, regarding UFOs. I don't think the Pentagon leadership quite realizes just how delusional it's become. I think these people are living in their own fantasy world, frankly, very likely believing the nonsense that they are putting out there to the public. I think that's very likely the case. You know, you tell yourself a piece of fiction for long enough, you end up believing it's true. And I think that's exactly what's happened to them. They believe these lies because they have to, because everything crumbles once they actually question their own narrative. And so what I think we're seeing is the latest salvo in a battle going on behind the scenes within the national security establishment relating to the intractable, always difficult, impossible subject of UFOs, UAPs. They don't know how to deal with it because, frankly, they've backed themselves into a corner. It's just like they have on so many things. Like when you make a statement over and over again that this is all nonsense, there's no truth to it, this is misrepresentation, where can you go from there? What else can you actually say to get yourself out of that? You really don't have any, you have no wiggle room. So you have to just double down, triple down, quadruple down on your statement, which is what they obviously appear to be doing here. So, you know, ultimately, the situation can't be stable. We're not in a stable situation relating to anything in this world, anything really. And so in such a situation of flux, I think we can assume things are going to continue to change. Relating to UAP disclosure, well, we're going to have to wait and see how far this can go. I have been skeptical. I will just say that the disclosure process is going to be everything that proponents want of it. I'm skeptical that it will be a full and honest disclosure of the actual truth, even of a partial accurate. Like, I don't believe that's going to happen. I think anything that we get will be deceptive. Let me give you one case in point. You know, when the UAP task force, the UAP legislation that came out last summer, the Schumer Amendment, which was mostly, let's just be honest, gutted back in December of last year. But that legislation was something that was designed to really force the government to come clean on UFOs. But, you know, ask yourself, how far could they really go with this? How much could the government come clean? Well, we know what happened. The whole thing got ripped to shreds, and there's really nothing remaining there. They've backed themselves into a corner here, and this is a very difficult situation for them to get out. We're seeing, though, there are factions that want to push this forward. We want to see, and we're seeing factions that are doing everything possible to keep things in a point of stasis for as long as they can. It's a difficult situation for them. But in my view, I've never seen any motivation within the genuine power structure of the Pentagon itself to just say, yeah, we're gonna have to give this up to the public and let them have the truth. But the point I wanted to make here before I forget, the model of that legislation that was gutted was said to be the JFK records assassination legislation from 30 years earlier. For those of you following the JFK assassination, this was a bit of legislation designed to declassify documents relating to the assassination of John F. Kennedy back in 1963. And it went into effect. And let me ask you, yeah, the law was passed, legislation was passed, and where are we with the JFK assassination? Just asking. We are still in a position of fundamental falsehoods, officially speaking, relating to it. In other words, that act has not helped in any substantial way getting the truth out on JFK, since everyone in the world knows that that man was killed in a conspiracy. Like, we all know this. And yet our official truth, the official establishment is like, oh, no, well, the evidence shows that Lee Harvey Oswald probably did it all by himself. You know, they hedge it nowadays because they're able to hedge the bet. It's been 60 plus years. You have official statements where people can say, well, maybe there was a conspiracy, but there's no proof, there's no evidence, so we have to just go on what we've got. When in fact, what you had back then was a seriously criminal, diabolical assassination of a sitting U.S. president, and they got away with it. They didn't just kill the president, by the way. They killed the president, and they killed all of these other people who knew something about the assassination. They left a trail of blood behind them, and they got away with it. And the entire JFK records law that was passed did not affect any of that. None of that was changed. We are still official for all of the information that supposedly has come out. We're still not getting the truth. And so that's the way I think what we're really looking at with UAP. If we get a disclosure on this, we have to ask ourselves, is this going to be a truthful disclosure? Is it going to be like with what happened with JFK? Because if it's like that, then clearly the public is not being served with anything that approaches truth. So that is where we are at. We're in a society where, you know, all of the truths that you thought you were being taught when you were in your elementary school about, you know, a system of government. Well, we have members of Congress. We elect the members of Congress. And if we don't like them, we can vote the bums out. And that's our system. It's messy, but it works. Well, it does work, but just not the way you were taught. It does work actually really well, just not how you were taught. So we don't have that kind of genuine democratic system. We have to be honest about this. We don't have a system of genuine rule of law that applies equally to people, and we don't have a system in which we have any kind of genuine transparency from our government, which is supposed to answer to us. And look, again, I'm not trying to pick on Sean Kirkpatrick. It's not his fault. I mean, you can have your own opinion on this. He's a government employee. He's doing his job. The AARO people who helped put that report together, they're doing their job. Their job is to obfuscate. Their job is not to be honest with you. And that's that. That's how it is. So it's our job, for those of us who care, who do the research, to continue digging, to continue doing everything that we know how to do to get the truth, the actual truth out there. We'll do our best. It's a long game. The game is not over. We will see how things end up at as this year goes on and as next year continues. And researchers need to continue chipping away at this. I don't think it's a hopeless struggle. I do think that we are entitled to the full truth on what is going on, whatever the truth is. There could be some very disturbing things about this. We just need to recognize that possibility. I personally think that there are some things that are probably disturbing. But the real question is, should we know about it or not? And I feel that you have a right to know. I feel that I have a right to know. If we're going to graduate to any kind of level of maturity as a society, as a civilization, one would think we really need to know the truth about this very important matter of a non-human, seemingly, intelligence that is all around us, operating with incredibly advanced technology every single day, doing something that is very important to them, that is not being discussed. And we have every reason and right to know what is being discussed. Well, that's all I've got for you. I hope you found this worthwhile. Hey, if you like what I've done, hit the like button, please. Share the video. Share it with friends. Subscribe to my channel. You know, go to my website, Richard Dolan Members, if you're really interested in what I'm doing and you want to see what I do here on a regular basis. I've got a lot going on there. Do come back. I'll be here with more videos in the future. I'm very glad to share this information with you. And thank you for all of your support. I'll be back again soon. In the meantime, let's keep fighting the good fight. Later.